Hi, and welcome to the Monday, November 18th, 2024 meeting of the Wayzata Planning Commission. I hereby call the meeting to order. My name is Larissa Stockton, and I'm the chair of the Planning Commission, and I have a few words about how to participate in this evening's meeting. First, we have some Zoom meeting information for the hybrid joining. The meeting ID number is 822-3921-5695, passcode 002818. Members of the public may attend this Planning Commission meeting in person or watch and listen remotely by viewing the meeting on Channel 8 WCTV and at the city's website at wayzata.org/WCTV. Public comment during the public forum and/or public hearing portions of the meeting may be provided in person at the meeting in advance or by logging into the Zoom call and raising your hand during the public hearing. When your name is called in the meeting, you will be seen and heard in our council chambers and the cable channel. You'll be asked to unmute, and then you may begin your comment. All public comments must include your full name and address. The city encourages comments and questions about items on the agenda, and when possible, requests you submit them in advance by emailing publiccomments@wayzata.org, calling city staff at 952-404-5323, or mailing Wayzata City Hall at 600 Rice Street, East Wayzata, Minnesota 55391. Attention, public comment. Great. Next, we can do our roll call. Planner Quarles, are you going to take our roll?
I sure can. Chair Stockton?
Me first today. Here.
Commissioner Planton?
Here.
Commissioner Schwalbe?
Here.
Commissioner Severson?
Here.
Commissioner Cameron?
Present.
And please note that Commissioner Elg has an excused absence today.
Thank you. Okay, so next we're going to move on to approving the agenda. Does anyone have any proposed changes to the agenda? And if not, may I have a motion to approve the agenda as presented?
I will make a motion to approve the agenda as presented.
Thank you, Commissioner Severson. May I have a second?
Second. Cameron?
Thank you. May I have any further discussion? All those in favor, please say aye.
Aye.
Those opposed, nay. The ayes have it. The motion passes, and the agenda is approved. Okay. Next, I'd like to move on to the approval of the consent agenda. This evening's consent agenda consists of two items: approval of meeting minutes of November 4th, 2024, which is item A, and B, approval of the report and recommendation for approval for zoning text amendments for cannabis business regulations. Does any commissioner have any questions or comments on any item on the consent agenda, or wish to pull an item for for separate discussion or action? Yes, Commissioner Severson.
I just noted several places that Commissioner Elg was noted as a council member. So it's on page 11, lines 29 and 35. But in other places, he was noted as Commissioner Elg, so I just wanted to make note of that.
Thank you.
Yeah.
So, Chair, I would say that you would, when you ask for a motion to approve the consent agenda in the minutes, that would be an amendment to the minutes.
Okay. The minutes would be an amendment to the minutes.
So moved.
Well, I'm sorry if that wasn't clear. So when you, I think Commissioner Severson has proposed some changes to the
Yes.
minutes, and when you ask for approval of the consent agenda, you can say with the minutes amended.
Okay. But first, I'd like to pull an item, so I would address that prior. Is that correct?
Yes, Chair, you can request yourself to pull
Yes.
that item for further discussion.
Okay, so I would like to pull an item for further discussion, which is item B. And my proposal is to move it to, I think, old business, as discussed, and therefore have an opportunity to bring some further discussion to council and staff. So on that basis,
Yes, Chair, so I would think if that's acceptable to your fellow commissioners, you could ask for a motion to approve item 4A of the consent agenda with the amendments noted by Commissioner Severson.
and pulling a B.
Yes.
Okay, so may I have a motion to approve the agenda with those two adjustments? To A, make the notes that Commissioner Severson pointed out, and on B, to pull item B.
So moved.
Thank you, Commissioner Schwalbe. May I have a second?
Second, Planton.
Thank you. All those in favor, further discussion? All those in favor?
Aye.
Those opposed, nay? None. The ayes have it, and the motion passes, and the consent agenda is approved. We have no public hearing this evening, but I think the old business comes next, which would be item number 5 on the agenda instead of other items. So I'm the one who pulled it, so I'll start talking, if that's okay. We had a very in-depth discussion and presentation around the consent agenda item B for the text amendments to the cannabis business regulations. Upon further reflection, I had some thoughts that I wanted to share with the commission and see if they are also thoughts that you share, and to make some further contribution to our recommendation to council as a result. The 4 topics were essentially, I'm summarizing here, but there's more thought behind it, but I'll go straight to the summary. The first is, one, the consideration of adding to the record that there is a private school bus stop in the west side of the Colonial Square, which is not covered by the current buffer zone, as was presented to us that evening. And I felt it prudent and important to bring that information to the table for consideration in case council had not discovered that fact themselves, and whether or not you also thought that that was an important consideration. I'll highlight the 4 things quickly, and then we can go back maybe to each one so you could have an understanding of where my concerns were. The second was, given the vast amount of dialogue and sort of thought around the buffer zones changing themselves, I wanted to suggest to council or that establishing criteria as to changing the buffer, like what that criteria would be, might be something that the city might consider establishing at this point in time, given the great length of dialogue and thought put into the process. I have ideas around that, but it's just something to think about. The third was to, if the zones were, buffer zones were significantly altered in the future, to put forward a request to council to consider planning commission's review of these zones, if there was a significant change, and how that would impact land use. And then 4, and maybe this is relevant to a newer or complex issue such as this one, and not most, but to request council's consideration that we're advised formally of when workshops are held, and that we could potentially sit in or listen to them, so that we can have the ability to digest their thinking for larger complex items, in an effort to understand the nature of something, and then therefore assign appropriate land use as a result of that understanding from council's direction. And so those are the 4 items. Does anyone have any thoughts? We can go back to the bus stop or any one of them in any order.
Yeah, I do. On the bus stop, is that always going to be a point of, like, is there always going to be a bus stop there? And where is it? Is it in those apartments north of it? Is that where you're?
So I know there's a public bus stop which is north, on the same side of the street as Colonial Square,
On 101?
on the 101.
Okay.
The private, I cannot speak for all private schools, but I can absolutely speak for one, that there is a bus stop which is, it shifts position a little bit depending on snow plowing and things of that nature, but it's been near the, primarily near the jute, in front of the jute area there, but also by the bagel shop. The extent of my understanding as to the change of that is unknown. That would be in the transportation system of each private school. But that has been my personal experience.
Okay, so it's in Colonial Square versus like at the, because I know there is a bus stop for Wayzata schools in the apartment building north of there.
So the public school, that sounds like what you're talking about, which I know less about. The private school is within the parking lot
Oh,
itself.
okay,
Yeah.
I wasn't aware of that, okay.
And that would be certainly pick up and drop off.
Yeah.
And I think now some of that has changed for the private school I'm discussing because there's been the closing of the Highcroft campus. However, there still is, so the prevalence is going to be less than my experience, but it's absolutely still there. And I would want council to be aware of the potential impact of their decisions in case they don't know about that and potentially further explore it before determining zones. So that was that one. Does staff have any further input on that item in particular?
Thank you, Chair. I did discuss this a little bit with the city attorney since your and I discussion earlier this afternoon. We think there's some merit to looking at things associated with schools like bus stops, but we are concerned that, as we stated on some of the commercial uses, that you look at all similar uses equally. So we would be concerned if we just parsed out the private school bus stops without looking at the public school.
Oh, yeah, I agree with that. I was speaking to my knowledge of the bus stops as opposed to isolating anyone in terms of a priority. But thanks for clarifying that. Which gets to the second item, which is criteria. Is school proximity a criteria? Is that, I don't know, because that's not my decision, but I guess what I'm saying is my thought would be to, as part of our approval process this evening, to have a finding of recommending to council that they do establish criteria for why the buffer is there and why or how it would be a trigger for advocating for a change in one direction or another from where it's established.
Are you talking about in the future? Or right now?
I'm talking about that both, in the sense that it's challenging to make land use recommendations when there's a variable that could change, may not likely change, but could change, and we don't know when or why and to what extent. So, yeah.
Chair, if I can just break in, I think that's a good way to put it, that to think about the buffer zones as a significant variable that was a basis of your finding and recommendation at the last meeting. And I know we talked about this as staff a little bit. The language in the findings of the draft report talk about that in a few places. I think it's 3 of your findings say something to the effect like this, we would recommend them in this area provided reasonable buffers are in place. We could, we talked about this as staff, we could make a modification to the report that would replace the concept of a reasonable buffer with the actual buffers that were presented to you at the last meeting, so that council can see that your recommendations are based on those staff-developed buffers, which were based on the city council's direction at their workshop. So what you see before you here on the screen from staff is some possible edits. Now, that's just part of what you're saying, Chair, I know, but it would at least alert council to the fact that that variable you're talking about, you were looking at the buffer zones presented at your last meeting when you made this finding, if that makes sense.
It does. A question just on the buffer zones, and we kind of delved into it a little bit 2 weeks ago, but at the state level, is there any requirement for any buffer zones in any capacity at all?
No, there is not.
So you could literally have one right next to a church, you could have one right next to a preschool,
Yes,
city of Minneapolis style.
exactly. And so the statute allows local units of government, like cities, to establish those buffer zones in certain specific places, and it's very it's explicit about schools, residential treatment facilities, areas of public parks where children may gather. There's also a general language in there about reasonable restrictions on time, manner, and place that my opinion is the city could probably look at creating buffers around bus stops. Again, with Planners Weber's observation, we would want to look at all bus stops where children gather right in the city, and that could be an awful lot of places. And we'd have to be careful that in doing that, we didn't all of a sudden make it impossible for a business to locate in the city. So like we talked about the last meeting, we're trying to strike a balance so that at least one retailer could locate here. If not, we'd be in violation of the statute. But the statute does allow us to place some restrictions, reasonable restrictions on time, manner, and place.
Which we haven't done yet, right? So, and I think that was
My point.
Chair Stockton's point is, like, kind of our recommendation is to go forward and say R2, R3, R3A, but if it goes forward just like that and nothing else changes, right, then one of those, you could put one of those businesses anywhere in that area, right? Because council is the one who's responsible for setting those buffer zones, and they haven't done anything like that yet. They haven't defined that.
That's correct. And my earlier point was to say that the findings of the draft report call out the fact that your recommendation is predicated on the fact that there would be these buffer zones as staff presented them. But you're right, until those are established, those businesses could locate anywhere within, well, presuming the zoning recommendations are adopted, anywhere in these C zones, including ones that could be right next to a residential treatment facility or a playground.
How they're established and on what criteria? Like, what's the goal of the buffer zones so that there's common understanding as to why they exist? Is it safety, or do they increase because the crime statistics have gone up? Do they decrease because crime statistics have gone down?
Right, and Chair, on that score, the statute allows cities to adopt any buffers for any reason based on health, safety, welfare, reasonable time, manner, and place. So it doesn't have, a specific set of criteria that cities need to apply to that.
Got
But
it.
as long as it's a reasonable time, manner, place restriction. And right now, the buffer zones developed by staff on council's direction are essentially at the maximum, with a little caveat on where we measure them from. Could potentially be a little bit greater in some of these, but for the most part, they're the maximum.
So can you apply time restrictions? Like, you can't open before 9 and you have to close by 3? Is that, can that be part of the buffer zone?
It can be part of the regulations that.
Part of the regulations.
Yeah, and again, that would be something that council's going to be looking at with the other regulations that they'll be adopting for registering businesses in the city.
Okay.
Well, and understand.
If I could,
Oh,
sorry,
yes.
if I could just expand on that a little bit. The state statute states hours that the business must be closed. And then of the hours that remain, they give the city a little bit of buffer to require them to be closed a little longer in the beginning and a little longer in the end. But the state statute does provide a set of hours that the community must allow that business to be open.
Oh, okay, I get it.
So they give us a little bit of latitude of the city could allow them to be closed more than what the state maximum amount of openness for that business is, but it wouldn't allow us to shrink that to like an hour.
Yeah, exactly, Chair.
Yeah.
Yeah, right.
Okay.
And that's something that was discussed maybe at the workshop. So that's where the sort of, it would be helpful for us to make our recommendations with more certainty, have learned what had been under consideration in that case, right? Hindsight is just a wonderful thing. But in this case, I think it's worth noting that the decision becomes more challenging when these parameters are not known for us when it comes to land use. For the reason, for example, of the bus stop, or many bus stops potentially. For the private schools, I don't know the public school bus stop situation, but for the private school, there's only like 1 or 2 pickup points. And that's, yeah, worth noting. Okay, so we've sort of mentioned all 4 items. Does anybody have any further thought on the idea, the other 2, which was to request or to ask council to consider that if the zones, buffer zones do significantly change, that they consider this coming before the planning commission again in that time? Yes.
Chair, if I could, maybe ask if you could expand a little bit on the 4th one, which my understanding was that's not necessarily cannabis specific, but
Yeah.
kind of any issue. So 2 things, because it's not cannabis specific, I don't know, and I'll listen to the city attorney on that. I don't know that it's appropriate being in this cannabis specific report and recommendation. But I did talk to the city manager about that after our conversation, and we have a couple ideas how to implement that. Both when the department heads talk about our work session agendas, adding the appropriate board or commission that would be affected by that. And then we could discuss, is it something that maybe could just simply be, in a phone call with the chair, updating that? Is that something more that should rise to the level of being on an agenda, that kind of thing? But the other thing we discussed, on the planning commission agenda, that we have today, we do have the section below that says upcoming meetings. We could expand that, particularly on the city council, to put land use related items on that council meeting, on that agenda. So, and/or we could, add that to our development activity. So I think there's a number of ways that we can add that. And city manager was real supportive of figuring out a way to communicate that more. But I'm just a little bit reluctant that 4th one isn't cannabis specific, that I don't know that it fits in the cannabis PC report.
I agree, it's probably not cannabis specific. However, the degree to which cannabis has a lot of unknowns that fall under policy
Yep.
brought this to our attention. And so, yeah, it's probably not cannabis specific. But I wouldn't want to request being in every workshop. I mean, I think it's at the council's discretion. It's more like, hey, this is something that, in hindsight, would have been a good one. And so with some foresight, are there other ways that we could spend to have our meetings be more efficient with some more understanding of policy direction and the items that we don't actually decide upon, but need to understand in order to prescribe land use?
I have one question.
Yes.
So without altering the buffers that we already talked about and included during our last meeting, are you suggesting, Chair, that perhaps there be like little mini buffers where the bus stops would be?
I'm not making any suggestions of that kind, more that I think what I'm saying is in our findings, we're adding some, in our motion, we're adding highlighting some supportive findings that aren't lost in all of the notes that we have, that touch on the potential impact of whether or not the buffers should include these bus stops or not, and how that impacts the overall recommendation that council has. It may not, but I feel a responsibility to bring it to the council's attention.
Thank you.
Yes, Commissioner Planton.
Yes, so is it appropriate to make a recommendation of approval with the following findings that we would like to have included or mentioned? One is regarding the consideration of bus stops. We don't know where they are exactly, but to have the council consider the location of bus stops as they exist today. The second would be if we find bus stops popping up, that there could be some flexibility if it affects the buffer zones and if it affects land use.
That's all.
That covers 2 and 3.
I mean, I think that's kind of still one.
Still one?
And then, but because 2 and 3 I see is slightly different. 2 is criteria, it could be outside of schools, right? It could, we don't know. Maybe there's nothing, you know. Maybe they want to, for example, consider the existing business of the rehab more closely. Whether or not that's, you know, maybe they don't, I don't know. But criteria would be good. Without crossing the boundary of commission to council, the criteria would be things like, you know, safety, right, around school children, and then, for example, off the cuff, like consulting with the police, chief of police, and inquiring at what statistically significant change has occurred, if any, with regards to any new addition to the business, to the city. And whether or not that impacts these buffers.
It's my understanding that's already included in state law?
But that's a separate thing, it sounds like.
Okay,
So it sounds like it doesn't have to be tied to this. Is that what you're saying?
yeah.
Chair, I think what I was referring to earlier about state law is that state law empowers cities to place reasonable time, manner, and place regulations on this within the parameters that state law has set, such as, well, you can't just say they can only be open 15 minutes on a Thursday night or something. And it says specifically that cities can create buffer zones up to 1,000 or 500 feet in certain sensitive areas. So when I read that whole section, I think there's room for the city to look at regulations that would address the potential health, safety, welfare issues around bus stops where children get off and on the bus to school. So there are, you know, what I hear you saying about criteria for council to revisit the,
Not to revisit the buffers, but it's like upon what I guess maybe it's semantics, but it's like, okay, well, if you have something that's a variable, on what basis do you change the variable? What are the criteria? What trigger trips in order to
Yeah.
say it's one way or another?
right. So I guess my earlier point was that I think it's the same criteria under which council would adopt those buffers in the first place.
Okay.
And so far, the direction they've given staff was to be fairly, to take advantage of the full extent to which a city can adopt those buffers. And so, and that's based on health, safety, welfare, reasonable time, place, manner restrictions around these activities. So that's how
The reason
staff
why I'm
came
getting
up
hung up on the criteria is because I didn't understand all the criteria in the first place. So it sounds like there's already some of those things in there that, again, goes back to the workshop and yeah, great. The only other thing was, Commissioner Planton, if we're making a finding, is the request to see it, again, if there is a significant change in the buffers as a finding to council.
That you want them to bring it back to us?
Like, if suddenly, let's use an extreme, there's no buffers, instead of it just being approved, it comes back to Planning Commission to look at appropriate land use first. That's just a request. It doesn't have to be granted, but it's something that I thought about since we're in charge of land use.
In Chair, I think the suggested changes that are on your screen now get you halfway there.
Okay.
I think you're making clear to council that your recommendations are based on the buffer zones that were presented by staff at your last meeting.
Yeah.
I think you could go the whole way by adding a finding at the end that just says, you know, should council adopt buffer zones that are significantly different than the ones that were presented, the Planning Commission would request that you revisit that. And it wouldn't be binding on council, but
No.
they would take that into account.
Yes. Yes, that's what we're saying. So, back to Commissioner Planton. So how does she add that into the last finding?
My notes are I'm going all over.
Commissioner Planning, I thought you had a good suggestion about the bus stops. What was that? about adding in,
Adding a consideration of that as they are today and as they may change. That we consider that and take that in.
yeah, so I think that's an easy addition to your report and recommendation at the end, just that council would look at that. Yeah.
And then if there are any significant variables in the changing of the buffers that they would consider, if it does affect land use, bringing it back, of course, to the planning commission.
That sounds right.
So Chair, if you want to ask for, I'm sorry, go ahead.
I was just going to suggest that those two items be stated as items H and I in the findings of the Planning Commission report and recommendation.
I would be in favor of that.
So Chair, if you'd like to, you can ask for a motion to adopt the report and recommendation with the edits prepared by staff that are reflected on your screen and the two additional findings articulated by Commissioner Blanton.
Okay. Can I have a motion for that? I can say it again, for the report and recommendation of approval with the findings on the screen and the two additional as stated.
So moved.
Thank you, Commissioner.
moved.
Thank you, Commissioner. May I have a second?
Second, Severson.
Thank you, Commissioner Severson. Further discussion? All those in favor, please say aye. Aye. Those opposed? Okay, the ayes have it. Thank you. The motion passes, and we'll move on to City Council. Is that correct? That will pass on to City Council from here.
Yes, Chair, that's correct.
Okay.
This will go on to City Council, and they'll take up the zoning ordinance amendment. When, Eric?
It will be December 3rd.
Okay, great. That's good
And
to know.
that, Chair, will be the first reading, and then there'll be a second reading, and then the ordinance will take effect. So the second reading will be at the second meeting in December.
All right, great. Well, thank you very much, staff, for helping us work through those details, and council and commission. Appreciate it. Great. Well, that's great. Thank you very much. Next, we can move on to item 6 on the agenda, which is other items. We have 2, which is to A, review of development activities, and B, the planning commission meeting schedule. Planner's waiver.
Yes, regarding development activities, if you've been driving by the former Wells Fargo site, you will see that the old building has pretty much been demolished. Getting ready for the apartment building to be constructed. We have approved the development agreement for Westway condominiums, but we're still having discussions with them about their building permit. And then we are currently negotiating the development agreement for Moments of Wayzata. Planner Quarles, did I miss anything on development activities?
I think that the only other thing to note is when it comes to our R3A study of new houses in the R3A district, we have a survey out right now to the community. Went out in the Friday weekly newsletter and already has almost 50 responses, which is amazing. So I would encourage you all to take a look at that. Those results will be summarized along with code changes that'll come forward to the Planning Commission at the December 16th meeting. So just an update that that's continuing to roll along.
That's great. Thank you. Do we have a new 2025 calendar coming out soon?
Yes, and I'll have it attached at the next meeting so that everyone can review. And if you already know that you'll have some vacations in the spring, definitely let us know.
That's great. Thank you. All right, wonderful. Well, I think that's everything. We've covered other items. If we can move to adjournment, so.
Chair, if I
Oh,
could. Just under Planning Commission meeting schedule, what would be our next regularly scheduled meeting on December 2nd is canceled due to lack of items. So our next Planning Commission meeting would be December 16th.
Perfect. Thank you. Okay, great. Well, thanks, everybody, for your participation in this evening's meeting. That concludes all the items on our agenda. Can I have a motion, please, to adjourn?
So moved.
Thank you, Commissioner Planton. May I have a second?
Second, Schwalbe?
Thank you, Commissioner Schwalbe. Any further discussion? All those in favor, please say aye.
Aye.
Those opposed, nay. The ayes have it, the motion passes, and the Monday, November 18, 2024 meeting of the Wayzata Planning Commission is adjourned.